Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme. Keep your friends close, your enemies closer, they say. So what is NATO's aim as it tries to come together after the fractious Trump years? There is a rare, these days, face-to-face for the Western allies as they meet to assess the threats of 2021 and beyond. But what are those threats? This is Roundtable. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. One thing that makes this meeting particularly compelling is that it will happen just before the new US president gets to shake hands with the leader of the country that some see as NATO's arch enemy, Vladimir Putin. Joe Biden is attending the summit as part of his first foreign trip since becoming US president. According to NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, China and Russia will be among the issues discussed. After a meeting with Biden last week, Stoltenberg said leaders of the Chinese government, as he put it, don't share our values. He also said that NATO agrees with Biden's approach of dialogue with Russia. The US and Russian presidents are due to meet this week. Climate change, cyber attacks, and troop withdrawals from Afghanistan are also on the agenda at this NATO summit. And after former President Trump's threats to pull out of the organization, will relations with European states improve? I'm delighted to be able to say that we can go to Washington, D.C. and say hello, first of all, on this program to Rachel Rizzo. She's from the national security think tank, the Truman Center. Then we whiz across the Atlantic to Leicester, United Kingdom. Mark Webber waits for us there, author of What is Wrong with NATO and How to Fix It. And then we go to Brussels. Tania Latici waits for us. She's from the Center for European Policy Analysis. I'm going to come to you in a moment, Mark, and ask you what is wrong with NATO, how you single-handedly plan to fix it. But Rachel, you first of all, 30 member countries in NATO, 11 of them new to the organization since 9/11. How have the threats that the Western world, as encompassed by the NATO membership, faced changed since the turn of this century?
Well, as you know, the United States will mark 20 years since the September 11th attacks this coming September. And so I think it's a really good time to reflect on how those threats have changed. Of course, the threat of terrorism has been the strategic lens through which the United States and many of our allies have viewed security over the last couple of decades. But it is different today. We're now facing two near-peer competitors in China and Russia, that the NATO alliance as well and the United States must have a strategy. We're facing much more esoteric threats such as climate change and hybrid and cyber and pandemics that don't fit the traditional paradigm of security challenges. And so going forward, I think that's what we'll have to think about. And that's what the upcoming NATO summit will address.
Mark, let me ask you, is NATO equipped to deal with the kind of threats that it now sees emerging? Has it fixed itself in the ways that you suggested? Is it still fit for the 21st century?
In a word, yes. I think I would preface my verdict on NATO with this important point. In trying to understand what to fix, I think we have to be clear that there's already quite a lot right with NATO. It is the single most important bridge across the Atlantic in security terms and political terms. For the Europeans, it remains the single most important format for collective defense. So in that sense, there are certain things that don't as such need fixing because the mission is already very clear. One thing I pointed out in the book, and actually it worries me at the moment, is that NATO has spent the last 30 years acquiring functions and not relinquishing them. And its current agenda is already extraordinarily challenging. And what worries me is the accumulation of more things it fails to actually deliver upon. Now, it is, of course, the case that NATO is engaged in a division of labor with other institutions. NATO alone is not significant enough to deal with climate or COVID or whatever. But I think that proper division of labor needs to be thought through very carefully, and we need to be very clear on what our expectations are for the alliance in this very challenging and fluid security environment.
I would bet that one of the things you say it's not properly equipped to deal with at the moment is the threat of artificial intelligence and tech, and we'll talk about ways they're talking of changing that as we go through the program. But I want to bring Tania in at this particular point, because since 9/11, we have seen an awful lot of Eastern European countries. In fact, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've seen many more Eastern European countries coming into the organization than before. And I wonder if you could tell us what you think they would say the priorities are in terms of looking for protection from NATO.
Well, I think it's very clear that for the eastern flank of NATO, the Russian threat remains a very, very present threat, as we have seen in the last weeks, where Russian troops were amassing at the Ukrainian border, which is, very close from my own country and from many other allied countries.
Your own country being Romania, sorry, I should say.
That's correct. Crimea is also very, very close to Romania as well. So for us, the threat is there. It's very real. At the same time, I think we have seen throughout the Baltics, we've seen Poland, we've seen Romania as well, also starting to care more about this enlarged scope of security threats, about resilience, how to ensure one's resilience, about cyber attacks, about disinformation, which again fit into this wider scope of 360 degrees threats that NATO has started to look at. So I think it's ultimately about maintaining the balance between ensuring defense and deterrence, upgrading defense and deterrence for the 2030s, which is what this summit is looking at, while making sure that NATO is also equipped to face the new threats that we are facing and that we are continuing we will continue to face.
If you could hone in on what it is the Eastern flank countries would like to see in terms of this vision for 2030, in terms of the threats that they believe they face and would ask NATO to deal with.
Well, I think the alliance is fairly aligned at this point. The NATO 2030 reflection process was all about that. And again, it's about balancing all these different things. I think that perhaps here I disagree a bit with Mark, because I don't think that NATO can afford to not care about resilience, to not care about climate change. Sure, NATO has a smaller role to play, perhaps, in terms of regulating climate change or the climate change international regime, but it can form certain partnerships to do that. And I think the Eastern European members are very much aware of that, while making sure that the focus does also remain on the Russian threat, on the Baltic and the Black Seas, where again the Russian threat is really present.
Shall we hear from Joe Biden now, and then reflect, both Rachel and Mark, on how his approach to NATO is likely to differ from that of his predecessor?
In Brussels, I will make it clear to the United States' commitment to our NATO alliance in Article 5 is rock solid. It's a sacred obligation we have under Article 5. The U.S. and the U.K. are both founding members of NATO, the strongest military and political alliance in the history of the world, and that's not hyperbole. Our troops have stood shoulder to shoulder around the world, including serving bravely in the mountains of Afghanistan for the past 20 years.
So the words rock solid, some things being sacred to the US president, how does that differ, Rachel, from what Donald Trump would have said, and how heartening might that be to European NATO members?
Well, as we know, the Biden approach to Europe and transatlantic relations is a complete 180 from that of the Trump administration. We saw the last 4 years, Trump consistently harp on European allies to spend more, that they weren't doing enough. He actually said that the European Union was created to undermine the United States. So Biden has a lot of trust to build back in that sense. So he is going to this first trip overseas to Europe with a message. He's a pro-NATO, pro-European president. He's a president who won't create consistent friction with European allies. He wants to send a message that democracies of the world are standing together to take on the toughest challenges. As you know, Biden views the current geopolitical context in this broader sense of democracies versus authoritarianism. And so that's really the message that he wants to send. He'll also unequivocally support Article 5.
And it's going to, with Article 5 being the one which states that if somebody attacks me, then you, the rest of NATO, are obliged to defend me. I just wanted to point that one out at that particular point, because I want to get on to something that you touched on, Mark, if I may, and that was the new threats, artificial intelligence, cyber warfare. Now, I was reading, it was an interview with Jens Stoltenberg, in which he said, for decades, NATO allies have been leading when it comes to tech. That is not obvious anymore. And I wanted to ask you about this new tech innovation center that's being set up. The idea being, as I understand it, that it would marry up military intelligence, if you like, those that understand things from a military point of view, with civilian intelligence on the most complicated matters that we're seeing at the moment when it comes to advanced technology.
It may well be the case that the other guests on this call know a little more about the detail of this initiative. I think it's important to point out that the initiative you've pointed to has not yet been agreed. It's anticipated it will be agreed in the summit declaration. And if it is, it appears to be a voluntary arrangement where some allies will pitch in and collaborate on technological innovation.
Is it an admission that NATO has fallen a long way behind its competitors when it comes to this sort of warfare?
I think it's an admission that it's very worried about the progress that's evident in China. The technological race had always appeared to be one which favoured the United States. If you go back to the Gulf War I, which was a signal moment in the revolutionary military affairs, it was clear that the United States had an advantage, certainly at that point, over the last days of the Soviet Union and certainly over China. That is less and less the case as people worry about hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence, new generations of nuclear weapons and so on. I think it is still the case that the United States has the advantage. The worry is for how long. And given that there appears to be an increasing alignment between Russia and China in military affairs, Russia is China's largest supplier of arms, there is a distinct worry in the United States that it needs to up its game in this regard. It is interesting that it is looking to NATO to do this, because the fact of the matter is the United States is already well ahead of European countries in most areas here. So I think this is about the development of niche capabilities and also the diffusion of technology from the Americans to some, not all, trusted allies in Europe.
Tania, you were nodding when Mark started to speak and when he suggested that you, and indeed Rachel, might know more about this than he does. So say what you want to do about this new initiative. And then I want to ask you about women, peace and security.
Well, it was certainly not on purpose. I was smiling because I'm happy about this initiative, because I also co-coordinated what we call the NATO 2030 Young Leaders Report, which we presented to the Secretary General in February, and where we recommended that the alliance set up exactly an entity of this kind, a defense accelerator that combines civil and military technologies, that harnesses this dual use kind of capacity of technology, and that also sets up, a network of technology scouts, so that NATO needs to do more to ensure its technological edge, to not take it for granted.
Since you know a lot about it, can you identify for our viewers, indeed for me, the particular threats that you would like to tackle or see tackled with this?
I am not a tech person myself, so I cannot go into the distinct details of the different technologies. But the idea is to ensure that NATO has this technological edge. And this is not, disconnected from the whole agenda on resilience. It's not disconnected with the whole agenda on climate change, because part of NATO's ambition in climate change, which is to set the gold standard in this, as Jens Stoltenberg has said, is to do this by also developing sustainable technologies. So I expect this aspect to also be a part of that.
I tell you what, at this stage, we're going to hear from Jens Stoltenberg himself on some particular threats that he thinks exist out there.
I think the biggest challenge is that we live in a much more unpredictable world, and we see much more global competition. So we need to be prepared for a wide range of different challenges and threats at the same time. A more assertive Russia responsible for aggressive actions against neighbors. China coercing neighbors and investing heavily in new military capabilities. Cyber threats, we see more sophisticated and frequent cyber attacks against the NATO allies.
So he's saying, Rachel, that there's a lot more out there than tanks and troops. What in particular do you think he's worried about, A, when it comes to Russia, B, when it comes to China?
So I think that today, the real threat to NATO are these sub-Article 5 level challenges. These aren't obvious threats where you have like Russian tanks rolling through the Baltics. These are hybrid threats, cyber threats, and those are the challenges that NATO really needs to be prepared to deal with, and which emanate from Russia and China. I think it's important to remember that this upcoming summit will be couched, as Tania has mentioned, within the broader context of NATO 2030, which is an ambitious agenda that lays out a strategy for NATO to deal with the most important challenges of the next decade. We can expect the summit to task the Secretary General for a new strategic concept as well. The last, of course, was written in 2010 and is now out of date. Great power competition will likely feature in that strategic concept. And of course, that is Russia and China. So these are two near-peer competitors, as I mentioned. China is challenging the liberal order far beyond the Indo-Pacific region. And so things like resilience and NATO's consultative process are going to be very helpful when it comes to dealing with the challenges of Russia and China simultaneously.
Can you possibly give us some concrete examples? Or maybe, Mark, maybe you'd like to think about this as well. But Rachel, can you give us concrete examples of where you feel Russia and China are threatening NATO allies with these new types of warfare?
Absolutely. I think Russia is not the only strategic competitor who consistently conducts cyber operations, offensive cyber operations, against not just the United States, but other Western democracies as well. This also goes for China. And so I think when it comes to cyber, as the other guests have mentioned, that's going to be a very important topic of discussion. And NATO really does have to ensure that cyber features heavily and highly on the agenda going forward.
Okay, Mark, you were nodding, so say whatever you want to say. And I wonder if there are any instances of the kind of warfare that we've just heard referred to that might make our viewers think, oh, that's what we're talking about, is it?
Well, there's the security environment, if you like, is very noisy. There are a lot of different threats and risks which the Secretary General and the allies have to worry about. But I think the signal in the noise, and it's becoming increasingly clear, is a return to a form of great power competition. And it's not accidental, for instance, that the recent interim national security strategy of the United States is very clear in singling out China in particular, followed by Russia, and then another list of rogues, including Iran, North Korea, as part of that more competitive world. Now, in some ways, this is quite conventional, even old-fashioned thinking, but it doesn't disregard pandemics, the environment, terrorism, migration, and so on. What is interesting, however, is that the hierarchy of threat has clearly changed. And I think the 2014 intervention in Crimea is the evidence of that, and that would be a very interesting example for those watching, that entailed a paradigm shift in the way in which the allies, particularly in Eastern Europe, thought about their security, a return to borders and territory, and a sense that an alliance is important to protect those things because one cannot do it alone. Now, interestingly, the United States, that raises its significance in the alliance, because if you return to territorial collective defense, the United States remains the most important ally, which can guarantee you security and safety in that world.
Hold the thought, Mark, about what's happened in Crimea and tie that in with the Russian troops' presence on the Ukrainian border, because we have understood in the last couple of months, yes, they said some of them were moving away, but a significant number still remain there. So we'll come back to that as we bring this program to a conclusion. But I wanted to ask you, Tania, I did say women, peace and security. It was a United Nations Security Council resolution adopted towards the end of last year. It's a bedrock of NATO these days. What does it want to do? It wants to protect women, I know that, from murder, rape and all other kinds of aggression, but it also wants to include women in what it's doing.
It's very simple. Essentially, NATO needs to streamline and wants to streamline this WPS agenda, as we call it in the acronym alphabet soup, in all its processes, in all its policy planning, for this to translate when it comes to out-of-area operations, when it comes to partnerships, and of course, when it comes to women in management positions and how staffing matters are handled. But perhaps if I could derail this a little bit, because you also asked before about China, and I think it's an important aspect to briefly touch upon. And I think it's important to bring up because it will be at the summit. It will be discussed. The Secretary General said that. But I think it's important to notice that the NATO Secretary General is very careful with his words when he talks about China. And here you'll notice that he never brands China as a threat, but he brands China as a challenge. And this is an important distinction because China is a challenge in many respects when it comes to technological dependencies, when it comes to buying political influence through investments, intellectual property theft, and many others. And this is something that NATO has to care about. This is why we've seen issues like economic security and resilience coming up very highly on NATO's agenda. And I think this has served again to reinforce the agenda of cooperation between NATO and the European Union, which again will also be on the table of the summit.
Yeah, because NATO brands itself as a political and military alliance. So increasingly these days, Rachel, it is more of the diplomatic, the political side of things as well as the bangs and the bullets?
Absolutely. I'm going to follow up on one thing that Tania said really quickly about China. And I think it's important to notice that Jens Stoltenberg has said that NATO tackling China isn't about pushing NATO into the Indo-Pacific region. It's about the response to China's inroads into various European countries and throughout the globe. So I think that's an important distinction. And yes, I think that NATO is much more than just a military alliance. It's an alliance of values. And I think that will be very important to discuss over the next 10 years as numerous countries within the alliance are seeing societal and governmental changes, which could lead to a situation in which the allies don't agree on a common value set that they should defend, which in turn means that the very foundational tenets of NATO, such as Article 5, become weakened as a result. So this is something I think that's very important and that the allies will focus closely on over the coming months and years.
Which sort of brings us back, Mark, doesn't it, to the point I was going to ask you, which is about the still considerable number of Russian troops on the Russian side of the border with Ukraine. Is Russia trying to test NATO here? And if so, what kind of response would be suitable from this summit?
If it is testing NATO, I think that's a secondary consideration from Russia's point of view. Its main consideration is to exert political influence in those areas around its borders it considers by historic right that it has some domain over. That is an entirely illegitimate view, in my opinion, but nonetheless, I think that's its principal purpose. It is a secondary purpose in turn to demonstrate that it remains a credible military power. And that, of course, is worrying to East European allies. Russia has done something similar in Syria, of course. It has done something similar in Armenia and Moldova and elsewhere. Russia is very keen to retain its credibility politically and militarily as a great power. That signals, secondarily, to NATO that it remains a power of strategic parity with NATO. That may not be true materially, but that is the political message I think it wants to put across.
Okay, about 2 minutes left. And Tania, I'll come to you at the very end because you represent an Eastern European country by birth, Romania. We've heard an awful lot about the countries that feel threatened by what's happening in Russia. Ukraine, of course, not a member of NATO, but it is what's called an aspiring member, along with Georgia. Are you very worried that NATO is unprepared for what it might see or face if and when Russia decides it's going to move across the border?
My faith in the power of NATO's deterrent is rock solid. So no, I don't fear that. And I think this is the feeling across the alliance. Of course, Eastern European allies are lobbying, as we've seen in the media recently, for reinforcement of the NATO deterrent on the eastern flank. I think that's not unreasonable to expect. I think this upgrade and continuous reinforcement has to happen because the threat evolves and we need to adapt to that. But no, I have the utmost confidence.
But then you have to be extremely careful.
NATO deterrent.
Very, very careful indeed if you have tens of thousands, if not 100,000 plus Russian troops on one side, and NATO has built up its forces on the other side of this curtain, if you like. It's a flashpoint to be concerned about.
Of course, we have to be concerned about it, and of course, everyone is paying attention to it. But I don't think that NATO has amassed forces at the border. NATO has a perfectly legal rotation force that is currently operational, and that acts as a tripwire deterrent, which we see works.
You're very kind. Thank you, each and every one of you. I could see both you, Rachel, and you, Mark. I hope wanting to say something more, but unfortunately, time is our greatest enemy, if not NATO's. We appreciate your expertise and your patience with my questioning. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. And wherever you happen to be picking up this edition of Roundtable, we thank you for taking the time to do so. Until next time, this is me, David Foster, saying thank you on behalf of our team. We hope you can join us again. Bye-bye.